Yeah, gotta aim for the top like, hold up. Yeah, I can never doubt myself, I know better. All of you critics be acting like you know better. Blowing the smoke, but I know when the dust settles that I'm in my element. It's evident that there's levels to the game.
Thank you so much, Alyson, for joining me today. I'm really excited to talk with you. You and I have known each other for some years now and kind of been in the IECA world together. And this is kind of our first time to be able to sort of sit down and kind of dive into a topic together. So thank you so much for joining me today.
Sure, Reid, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to do this. Thanks for the opportunity.
Yeah, of course. So we're going to dive into our topic here in just a minute, which is basically navigating kind of the divorced parent dynamics. And we're going to do it through the lens of a student athlete, just given the context that we're here now. But I would argue that a lot of what we're going to talk about is really quite universal for any family that's sort of going through this process. And it's something that a lot of families go through. It's one of those sort of topics that I feel like it's everyone sort of stays on the side. You don't really want to mention it sometimes, but like it's just part of this process. It's what we do, and it's something that needs to be talked about and handled accordingly. So, before we kind of kick off, can you just sort of give me, everybody, kind of your background and your inlay to the IEC world and the student athlete world?
Sure, I'd be glad to. So, I've been working in higher ed for about 10 years. I started my journey actually in college athletics as a basketball coach and women's golf coach. So, I served at a Division III institution, which is actually my alma mater. I did play college basketball for a few years at a Division III school. And then after that, used my sport management degree to move right into coaching. So, like I said, coached for 3 years, women's basketball, the head assistant, and the women's golf coach. And then I feel like it was a really easy thing for me to do as far as recruitment. I loved my alma mater. I was recruiting student athletes, and I was working a lot with the admission office. Just bringing recruits on campus and having to be up to date with any scholarship or admission policies that were changing. And it was a grind. Like working in college athletics, for anybody that's listening that does work in college athletics, there's really no days off, especially when you have two sports in two different seasons and a split season sport like golf is. But the admissions team recruited me, I'd like to say, over to the dark side. And it was such a great fit because it just was a little bit more of a good work-life balance for me. And again, I had already been doing a lot of the recruiting. I'm very social by nature and didn't have kids at the time either. So I was able to travel to a lot of the territories and it was wonderful. Then I had the surprise of a lifetime that I found out I was having triplets. So
Oh,
left the college admission world for a few years while I navigated that craziness. And during the pandemic, I started working for Ohio State and was just working virtually for them, doing like application review and whatnot. But it was a really cool opportunity for me to see how things worked at a private liberal arts school and then how things worked at a large state flagship school. I should have, I guess, prefaced that I'm from Ohio, so both within the state of Ohio. And it was very interesting to me because 20 years prior to that, when I was looking at Baldwin Wallace is the name of the institution I attended, and then working for Ohio State, how much Ohio State had changed and just the landscape of higher ed and how competitive it had become and the um, like what how testing played a role and some of the extracurriculars that some of these students were doing. It was just so interesting to me to kind of have that lens from being like at a small private school and now a large state school and did that for a few years. Then was connected to my current boss, Christina Dooley, also a triplet mom. It's weird how the stars align. And was introduced to the world of what the IECs do. And it was just such a cool like connection of everything that I think I really enjoyed about coaching, about being in the admissions world. And just I loved the personal relationships that I got to develop, when I was recruiting a student athlete, when I was getting to know families in the admissions office and they're contacting me and I'm helping to answer their questions. But the IECs, I feel like just have it's truly the best of both worlds where you get to know these students and you're kind of celebrating their wins. Like there's so many sports analogies, I think, as an IEC, because you're motivating them. You have a little bit of tough love sometimes, but you get to typically celebrate their wins alongside of them. So I've actually worked at Estrela Consulting for the last 3 years, And it's been such a fantastic opportunity, and just have enjoyed also getting into more of like the professional development side and making connections that way.
Awesome. Yeah. So I mean, obviously, from that background, entrenched on a lot of different angles when it comes to this whole thing. And I think what I find more and more too is I feel like one of the best kept secrets for people that are in athletics is doing this work, like doing IEC work.
Mhm.
I feel like it ticks so many of those boxes. You get to impact people, you get to sort of have that one-on-one communication, you get to develop these different skill sets. You maybe don't have to, like, as a baseball player, I didn't have to stand out in like 30-degree weather for a 4 hour, game or practice or whatever it
Mhm.
might be. So I don't know. I just feel like the more people I talk to, the more that makes sense and kind of a pathway there. But clearly, I mean, like you said, you've seen it from a small school perspective, you've seen it from a large school perspective, you've seen it as a coach, you've seen it on the admission side. Now, obviously, you're working with families. I mean, you've viewed this from a lot of different perspectives, which is so fun. Which is why it's so fun to talk to you about this kind of stuff because you can sort of pull all those different perspectives, and I'm excited to kind of see those as we kind of work through here. But shifting over to kind of the topic that we're going to discuss today, that kind of navigating divorced parent dynamics, to kind of kick off with this, just talk to me a little bit about how, obviously you've been kind of involved in this topic for a bit now and through our conversations. Tell me how we got there. How did that topic sort of peak up?
Yeah, so I am not a product of a divorced family. I'm really, really blessed that I have, two fantastic parents that get along really well. And I just feel like in this day and age, I mean, it's it's really rare. Like you had mentioned, like if you are not someone who is in a divorce dynamic currently, you know someone who is. I mean, I don't
Mm,
know exactly the statistic, but I would venture to say at least one third of,
mm,
divorces probably end in, or sorry, marriages probably end in a divorce. So it is very common. And it was just something that I didn't feel like in the IEC space we talked about a lot. So last cycle, I had, numerous families that I was working with, and I had a very contentious divorced family dynamic where um, I had to separate all of the communications. The student was just very anxious about it, like who I could send an email
mm,
to, who I could communicate with. Um, they lived separately, obviously. Um, there was a lot of, I want to say miscommunication, but lack of communication on the financial end, and that ended up hurting the student because there was items that were not disclosed, and then the student applied to probably schools that she couldn't afford essentially, and then she was left with
mm,
one or two viable options. And it was hard because again, you can only do so much and you can't force adults to uh, disclose things they don't want to disclose, but was trying to keep those communication lines open. It was just kind of rough. And then I did have another family that it was more of your traditional divorced family dynamic where I feel like mom and dad weren't best friends, but there was enough communication because they wanted what was best for the student in the long run. And
mm,
they communicated enough for us to be efficient and effective, but it wasn't lovey-dovey. And then my last one was fantastic, and they were they basically parents that just didn't work out on the romantic end, but they were still friends. They vacationed together. Please loop dad in on everything that we're doing. Like that was great. So those boys are really fortunate because I feel like they really benefited from just like a loving environment, and they were just like, yeah, just didn't work out. So
mm,
having, I feel like the roller coaster of emotions of all three of those, I wanted to dig into a little bit more about how other IECs kind of navigate this because it was tricky for me and, for our firm because we didn't really have anything set in stone. It was just kind of like a case by case basis. And the
mm,
more that I investigated this, some IECs have strict contracts about the communication lines and, is it the paying parent that gets to dictate who gets to know what happens when you do have parents that are not getting along or is causing a lot of stress on the student or the financial aspect of it, or there's not a lot of disclosure. So it actually led to me connecting to a few other IECs, and we co-presented at the IACA conference last year or this past year in Detroit. And it was just really interesting because I think it was more, we tried to provide more resources, like how you can
mm.
effectively streamline this process for families that are going through divorce. But ultimately, I think it ended up being a lot of war stories. Just like, oh, you can't believe this happened with my group, and this is what happened to me and whatnot. So that was, I think, a good outlet for a lot of the counselors that attended our session, just to be able to say like, yeah, this is normal, or this is like, oh, you thought this was an interesting one. Let me tell you about this story. But when push comes to shove, it all comes down to wanting what's best for the student or the student athlete. And again, like just being a coach, having to navigate that sometimes when you've got parents that are separated and, are they coming on two visits? Who is the one that we need to contact for, communication with the student? What happens when they both come to the games with the step parents that nobody likes or the step, it was always something. But that's kind of how that came about, was just organically through my own client load. And I'm like, this is not going away. Like, this is going to continue to be something that we face. And how can we help support our students in the best way that, they're going to have the best options for school, the best options for financial aid, the best fit for whatever athletic program they're pursuing. So that's kind of how it came about.
Yeah, I think it makes a ton of sense, and I definitely want to dive into the coaches elements a little bit later. But to kind of just kick things off, to your point, you mentioned you kind of had this, we'll call it a Goldilocks scenario of different families that had different dynamics in that space, led to a lot of conversations, led to even more conversations. So if I'm an IEC or I'm somebody who's working with, a divorced family in this space, what would you say? What's kind of the foundational first thing that you need to sort of set as far as working with families? And I think this is something that both parents and families can kind of take to heart of like, okay, if I'm going to work with somebody or if I'm going to do this college thing, here's kind of what we need to at least be aligned on in some capacity. And then from an IEC perspective, here's what I kind of need to lay out or help my families understand is the building block of how this is going to be successful. What do you think is sort of that like cornerstone piece that you kind of have to establish first with families?
Definitely communication. I think that is the root of this being a successful process for everyone. So just laying out again, we didn't have a contract established for divorced families, but it's something that we've definitely contemplated after, kind of getting feedback through our presentation. But I think communication just at every level, and that's divorced families and non-divorced families, but it's typically the trickiest thing because there's a lot of animosity or there's a lot of emotion, and you need to be able to establish as the IEC that I'm here to be this neutral third party. Like, I do not
Mm,
care, about what has happened in the past. I care about the student and their best outcomes. So, communication and clarity with, whatever maybe notes about your meetings or next steps. Who's the person that's taking those next steps? Also communication with the student, because I think that's something that as adults, we just tend to go right to the adults again versus taking into account, like, how does the student feel about this? So, I mean, this is a totally hypothetical scenario, but if, say, dad is paying for the services for the IEC and dad is dictating things, but stepmom is coming to all the meetings and giving her 2 cents about everything. There's been, times where a student might say, like, I really don't value my stepmom's opinion and she just really makes me angry every time she comes to
mm,
the meeting. So, like, do I have to have that conversation to be like, hey, this needs to be, dad, the student, and then I need to facilitate what I need to, let know to the mom, like the biological mom.
mhm,
So I think, again, just kind of understanding the dynamic of how the student kind of navigates this, is really important. So I think communication is the number one component, but also I think setting boundaries. So, like, I'm not a referee.
mm,
This is a sports analogy, but I'm here just to be like that neutral third party that is here for the best interest of the student. Um, so I'm not going to pick a side. I think when you have like a contract laid out where it is established perhaps that, you will be working or communicating only with the paying party. But if there are parts
mm,
that are dependent on the other parent, as far as like financial needs, so I can establish a list, or, even if the other parent has like very strong opinions about the realities of a list. And I think that's what kind of got caught up with my student last year was dad didn't want to disclose financial information. Mom was trying to sock it to dad, knowing that he could pay, like he had the funds, but he wasn't disclosing it.
mm,
Mom was trying to get the daughter to, she was applying to NYU and Tufts and Bowdoin and like just like all these schools. And I'm like, dad's not never going to pay for this. Then she would
Mm,
get into these schools, and we were left with one state school option that he would actually help her out with. So again, it was just utilized, it was almost weaponized a little bit.
mm,
And I was like, I just need to set up better boundaries for these types of situations and know, like, I mean, I did a couple times have to just step in and say, I'm under the understanding that you believe that dad, can pay for this, but I don't think the willingness is there. So
mm,
she's going to get into a few of these schools that are going to be, he's going to say no to. So unless you're willing to figure out loans or you have some, jackpot hidden somewhere that you're going to be tossing towards, it's like, I just don't think this is a feasible option. And I mean, it worked out for her as far as the state school that she's attending. It's a great school. She got a ton of money, but she had literally one option.
mm.
So,
Yeah. I think to your point that the communication aspect of it seems, I mean, obviously it's important in everything that we do, but even more so
mhm,
when you have, to your point, whether they're working together or in some capacities working against each other in these pieces. I think too, starting that early in the process can make a huge difference as well. Setting expectations and setting the stage for sort of all parties involved to say like, if you are going to work with me and we are going to work and do this, like here's what needs to happen for this to be successful, and then you allow the different parties involved to sort of either get good with that or
mhm,
understand that that isn't the way that they can work together. And while that may be unfortunate, like you're not putting the family, the kid, yourself into a position where no one's going to end up happy at the end of this because what they're expecting out of this program is not feasible, to be able to do right by the student, which I feel like is so many times what ends up being the collateral damage in a lot of these situations. So having that third party piece to your point of and sort of allowing that kid to come in and say, here's what I like and here's what I think, and then sort of helping them
mhm.
navigate how you manage those conversations and expectations with families and things like that. Yeah, it makes total sense. Is that something that you have now implemented into, let's say, like your contracts? Is there an addendum or something that comes into consideration for divorced parents? Is that something that's just communicated very transparently during intro calls? I'm just sort of curious where that
Mhm.
where that piece comes in.
Yeah, we have not done anything contractually with that, but I think it has definitely made us more mindful. We do a pretty intricate intake
Hmm.
form and process that we review, and then we review it with the parents on the first call. So definitely have been more mindful. And actually, I don't have any divorced families this cycle, but it shed a lot of light on what we could be doing better to kind of avoid that in the future. Um,
Hmm.
but I think also finding an opportunity to get the students' input transparently and kind of without the influence of a parent would be a good idea as well. Just to say, hey, I know that your mom and dad are divorced. I would just love to get your take on it because I want to make sure that you're comfortable that I'm serving you since you are, my number one priority. And, if you have any insight into that, because I think too, there's a lot of power dynamic struggles that go on sometimes in those conversations. And if whoever's like kind of leading that might say like, well, this is what we want out of this is how I want
Hmm.
things to be done. I don't want you to let mom know or whatever. So asking the student like, well, what do you prefer? Like,
Hmm.
you live with mom but dad's paying for this. I'm assuming you spend more time with mom. Would you like her to be looped into communication, or like, do I need to ask the paying parent, is that something that you're allowing? Because
Hmm.
again, they might say, no, we're not doing that. And also, sometimes it's helpful if there is some sort of divorce decree
Hmm.
that's established before. It's not always the case, but I feel like if the divorce has been finalized for a while, um, and there's a little bit of time, there's sometimes a decree, and sometimes they're just a little bit, it's not as volatile because they've had time to move on. They've got new spouses. They're living separate lives now. But sometimes if it's fresh or really volatile, then I like to kind of get the kid off to the side and kind of get a temp check.
Yeah, for sure. And being sort of that third party, I think it does give you a little bit of power and influence is the wrong terminology, but it allows you to talk in a more objective fashion with the families or with the parents to say, listen, we know you love your kid. This is what, not to rat the kid out or anything, but like, here's what I'm hearing, here's what I'm sensing, here's some of the
Hmm.
things that I think need to be. So y'all as two individuals that are, this is your dependent, like, can we figure out what does and doesn't make sense for y'all from a financial standpoint, from an acceptance
Hmm.
standpoint, and then that helps you shape, to your point, lists and things like that. So you don't have a scenario where you have kids that are getting into multiple schools and then they're left with feasibly one option because of what the expectations were. And I think that kind of leads into what I would imagine is kind of the second sort of cornerstone or second big piece of this process, which is the financial conversation, right? The finances
Yeah.
that come into this. And so, you know, I don't even necessarily want to like start with a pointed question so much as like when you think about the finances aspect of this, how what have you found to be kind of the biggest hangups? What have you sort of started to do to kind of address that early on to make sure that you're, you know, giving accurate lists and things like that? I mean, how does that
Yeah.
financial piece play into this for you?
That's a really good question, Reid. Actually, I think just establishing who would be responsible for the payment or who would be filing the FAFSA. It's the parent who provides the most financial support to the student.
Hmm.
That would be the parent that would be filling out the FAFSA and typically is the one most, responsible for covering the cost of college. Again, if they have established through a divorce decree or through arbitration or something where they're going to split it 50-50, or mom has this amount of money saved, dad has this amount of money saved, like that's totally fine and that's extremely helpful. But just establishing that off the bat, because I think there's a lot of back and forth of like, well, who's going to file the FAFSA? Like that's pretty clear now. I mean, it's pretty rare that you have families that are like, oh, we split it 50-50 all the way down the middle. Typically, one of
Hmm.
the parents does assume a little bit more financial liability. But I think you need to have the family budget conversation. So again, it's so hard because if there is a lot of animosity in the relationship, they don't want to disclose how much they make. They don't want to disclose how much they saved. But again, like it's just such a detriment to the student if there's not an established family budget of, or just give us a ballpark, like 40 grand is what we think that we could put together as two separate parents to send Johnny to school.
Hmm.
So establishing that, and then I think too, like from a financial standpoint, we did a webinar last month with a financial planner because we are not financial planners. Like we can do financial literacy, and I think there needs to be financial awareness, but I'm not going to tell a family, you need to invest in this, you need to move this money here with grandma and grandpa and whatnot. So we actually did a really good webinar last month, and I'm happy to send you that link if you want to share it with like the show notes. But it was pretty in the weeds with how a divorced family dynamic can really capitalize and plan and strategize for their student. So there was some really fantastic tips and takeaways. And I encourage anybody who's listening to this that's wondering about this, like what should I be doing? What should my ex be doing? How can we navigate this together to really to watch that webinar because it's pretty specific and there's some really great data-driven examples and some stuff with like the new legislation that I think people need to be mindful of.
Hmm.
So I think that is probably my best tip if you're looking for something more specific to getting in the weeds with the finances.
Yeah, that's excellent. And please do share that so we can put that down to your point. I think that's it's easy to sort of talk about it in broad stroke, right, in this type of
Hmm.
medium, but really being able to kind of get in the weeds for a family that needs to know kind of the nuts and bolts of, hey, how do we make this work? And how do we, how can we end up best for our kid at the end when we, to your point, are managing two separate finances and maybe don't want to get, in the weeds with each other on some of these types of things. So I think
Yeah.
that
And
makes,
he
yeah.
dives into, like if parent one is remarried to step parent
Mhm.
two, and then this person is not married, or this family, they were never legally married, but they have a child together. So there's a lot
Mm.
of great information because it isn't always just, male and female married get a divorce. There's step parents, there's same sex, there's never were married, or we're still married, but we're separated. Like that is still
Mm.
technically in the eyes of the state, like if they're not living together and they haven't shared finances, home, et cetera, like that's divorce technically.
Mm.
So there are a lot of nuances and specific circumstances that I think he does a really good job of covering in that webinar. So I would highly, highly recommend watching that if you have questions about it.
Nice. Yeah, thank you for sharing. And to your point, I mean, even just the point that you made right there, I divorce is such a blanket statement. it through this lens, right? And what does
Mhm.
that mean? What are the different caveats and what needs to be taken into consideration? So, to your point, that to really be able to dive into those different branches, if you will, and understand what applies to you and how to best manage that is something that would be super, super valuable. So, yes, please do share that. So, I want
Okay.
to segue kind of over to the athletics piece here, but before I do that, is there any sort of, anything I haven't asked, any point that you want to make on just sort of the base element of, hey, these are the things that I noticed on when dealing with divorced families or managing kids in these situations that should just sort of be shared for the good of the people before we kind of move into this more niche category.
Yeah, I just think communication is key. Setting expectations and limits. If you are if you're a counselor that's watching this and or listening to this, and then also just keeping the student as the focus of your work, and just making sure that you're doing the best by them. And it will get uncomfortable at some points potentially, and you're not a mediator, you're not an arbitrator, but trying to kind of remind yourself and go back to that point, when things do maybe get contentious or heated, like we have to keep the student's best interest in mind, like, and not weaponize this process. So those would be my biggest takeaways.
I love it. Yeah, I think, yeah, probably the most universal thing in this whole thing is everyone wants to do right by their kid. So if you
Mhm.
can keep that at the front, that makes a ton of sense. Ton of sense. Well, shifting over kind of on the athletic side, and I want to sort of go back a little bit and kind of dig into your coaching hat on some of this
Mhm.
stuff. We've talked about this from the admission standpoint. Obviously, we talk about it as IECs, and we kind of have these conversations. Now we add in this recruiting element, and that is sort of, as you know, and as we that sort of work in this know, that's building a relationship with this family, that's building a relationship with this student athlete, that's kind of learning more about these different elements. And so when you kind of throw in this aspect of, okay, now you've got sort of a non-traditional family background and maybe different players that are involved or different interests that are involved on certain spaces, what is what were some of the big things that you experienced with as a coach or in that space? Were you having to manage multiple schedules for multiple sides of the family? Were you having to, did you have different parents that had different priorities when they talked to you? Like, I'm just kind of curious, you talk about war stories. I'm just sort of curious what your experiences
Yeah.
were in that space or things that you've seen working with other kids.
I definitely remember going to recruit at basketball games, and we'd have practice until 5:30, and I'd race 2 hours away to go catch a game that started at 7. And you walk in and you don't know that much about these student athletes. When you first start recruiting them, you've seen them at a couple of events or they've landed into your funnel and you're kind of vetting it out. But quickly, maybe a parent identifies you and they notice the emblem on your jacket, and they come chatting, start talking to you. And then couple minutes later, another parent of the same student comes, and you're like, like just kind of navigating that, like in the stands. I feel like and again, I'm chatty, I'm social by nature, but I have had to do that where I've sat in multiple parts of the bleachers to appease mom, to appease dad, to meet the stepkids, to meet this person.
Mm.
So I feel like my war stories were mostly in the bleachers and at the concession stands, like talking with people, and trying to like keep everybody happy, when I would go to recruit a student athlete. But I think like when you're bringing student athletes onto campus, I mean, as most parents do, like there's a lot of pride. They're excited that their student athletes have this opportunity to be on campus, to meet with the coaching staff. And it's pretty evident right away, like what each parent's priority is. There might be a more practical parent that's really into, and again, this doesn't have to be a divorced family, but really practical parent that wants to know about, the academics piece of it, and study tables and tutoring, and what does a day look like, and can they get the classes that they're looking for because they're going to be at practice or at games on Wednesdays and Saturdays and things like that. And then you've got maybe a different parent that wants to know, like, when are they going to start, where do you see them in your program, um, wants to talk X's and O's with you. And again, that's not necessary, that could be married parents as well, but I feel like that was a little bit more prevalent when I was recruiting divorce, like student athletes that
Mm.
had divorced parents. Like there was just like very different um priorities maybe in the recruitment process. But I don't know, I can think of like three off the top of my head where that was definitely the case. um and I feel like too, just like navigating, because I coached a Division 3 school, and we were just like a big family. And I think most successful college athletic programs, they do try to like include the families and the parents and things after games, and they travel together, and there's meals after games and things like that. But you have to be mindful again because the student athlete is your main priority and you don't want them to be uncomfortable. But, if mom's there, if dad's there, if they don't get along, like again, as a coach, I'm trying to do that divide and conquer to make sure
Mhm.
that I'm appeasing both, or I'm not like just talking to mom and then nobody talks to dad.
Mhm.
So I think that again, maybe just navigating like the dynamic to keep everybody happy
Mhm.
in those student athlete things because you're looking out for the kid both as when they're a recruit and once they're on your team as well.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I'm curious too, and I think this probably adjusts from coach to coach because it may be more of a personal preference and sort of how you like to manage things. But to your point on your end, right, you're trying to appease mom and dad in this scenario, or spouse one, spouse two in this scenario. Are there are there things that parents do in this scenario that can make it such that great kid, great talent would fit well with the team, but man, this is something that just feels like it's out of my depths. Like, is there a family dynamic element that's ever come into play where you're like, man, if spouse one and spouse two could just avoid doing this, that would really make it's that's something that's hard for me to balance. There may not be anything, but I'm just curious from a coach perspective when thinking from the parent lens.
Yeah, I have a few. I mean, I feel like one that we've dealt with, and again, this doesn't necessarily have to be like divorce parent dynamic specific, but if one parent is really motivated by like scholarship,
Mm,
if I would meet someone maybe at like an AAU event and they're really pushing for the D1s and the D2s, and I'm thinking like, first off, she's not D1 or D2. She's probably going to land somewhere like at a Division 3. And again, there's some stellar Division 3 athletes, but I think just if you're in that space too, it's like a size and a speed and a like specimen difference between the divisions a lot of times. If like one of the parents is just really pushy about scholarship. And I
mm,
sometimes I think it's like lack of education, lack of understanding that like, yeah, like you could get an $8,000 scholarship at said D1 or D2, but they're a good student. They're going to get twice as much money at a Division 3 for their
mm,
academics. So that gets kind of slimy. And again, sometimes it's just you got to backpedal them and say, listen, like let's talk a little bit more about what we could offer outside of the athletics money, that you're kind of being hung up on. So say one parent's really hyper focused on athletic scholarship, and then the other parent, maybe is just really interested in fit, which is where I think you and I both really align is it's really about finding the right fit for the student athlete, academically, athletically, financially, socially, distance from home, program, is it the right program that they kind of align with? So I think that can be hard to navigate when one parent is really motivated by like the athletic allure and the other parent's a little bit more grounded. Like, well, I think we just need to find the best fit for the student athlete. I would say like if there's like maybe like really bad vibe or a parent is speaking really ill about the other parent and it's not the student athlete's fault, like they really can't
mm,
control that. But I mean, if it gets really like vulgar, degrading, unnecessary, that's a red flag because I don't want to deal with that as a parent or
yeah.
as a coach, to have mom or dad like saying all these negative things because ultimately that's going to affect the student athlete as well. And again, I don't want to penalize them, but as a coach, you're already balancing so many things. Like the last thing I need to do is invite like this ticking time bomb into our program. So I think that would be a major red flag for me is if the parents were just really degrading or disrespectful towards one another or the student athlete. Um, so I think those would probably be like the most blatant things that kind of stick out to me when I'm navigating divorced family dynamics as a coach.
Yeah, no, and I mean, to your point, the bummer of all of that is the ricochet shot always ends up hitting the student athlete, which is the worst piece of all of it. But I think if parents realize, even if you don't like each other, don't, there's places where you need to cinch it up, for lack of a better term, on behalf of your kid when it comes to these types of things. And so I think just knowing that, whether or not families feel certain ways, it's I don't know, knowledge is power on a lot of that kind of stuff. I was
Yeah.
curious too, on the student athlete side. So say, you're a coach, student athlete reaches out, or you're recruiting, is there any onus on a student to share with you that their parents are divorced? I feel like for a lot of kids, it's obviously a very big piece of their life. So they feel
Mhm.
like it's a, people need to know this or this is a part of who I am. Like, do you as a coach largely care about that, or are you just trying to get to know this athlete and that's information that's just sort of naturally going to come out as you start to meet the family and learn more about them?
I wouldn't say it's a make or break, but I think the value of what I got to do as a Division III coach was I did get to know a lot of our recruits really well. And, it kind of came out organically. And I got to the point where I could just say, like, hey, what's the deal with mom and dad? Like, I'm just curious, like, do they get along? Like, everything cool? And just kind of taking their lead on that. But also, like we were saying, how we don't really want the student athlete to be collateral, but even offering some sort of suggestion if you do feel like there's a lot of tension between mom and dad, to say, like, hey, like, we'd love to get you guys on campus, and would it be feasible for you to come with mom one time and then come with dad another time, so then that way you can show them both and it doesn't feel like you don't have a lot of anxiety about the visit. You can kind of show them what's important to you, and we have opportunities to talk with both of them, again, without like kind of like notching down the anxiety or tension for you and for them together, um, and kind of offering up those lines of communication to both parents too. Like, hey, we think Sarah's a great human, great student athlete, would be a great fit for our program. Like, what are your thoughts on coming separately, bringing her
Mm.
one time to campus, having dad bring her the next week? Again, like, we don't want to make it uncomfortable for either of you or for Sarah. So let us know your thoughts on that. So just at least giving that option and acknowledging it, because I don't think there's a lot that comes out of pretending like it's not happening and like trying to tiptoe around it, with that, like that pink elephant in the room. So, I mean, if they're divorced, great. Like, let's acknowledge it, let's respect it, and let's strategize a way that we can work with that student athlete and their parents.
Yeah, I love that framing of it, right? It's knowledge is power. I want to be able to manage this appropriately and make sure everybody's involved in the process in the right capacity, as opposed to just this thing that kind of exists over on the side. We all
Yeah.
got something. That's the something. Now we know. That's great. So
Yeah, and it's never
I
going to
think,
go away. Like, if they do end up at your school, you still have to navigate this. And like, I think it's just better to
yeah.
preface it on the front end and like get to know the parents individually during the process. Um, and to see if, again, if it's a good fit, versus just like pretending like it didn't happen just to get the student there. And like, it's that discomfort will still be there if you don't address it.
Well, thank you so much, Allison. I appreciate your time today, and I'm sure we'll be speaking with each other probably sometime in the next month in our student athlete affinity group. So that'll be great.
Sounds good. Thanks so much for having me, Reid. I really appreciate it.